These famous folk dances are frequently asked in exams. Which is the famous folk dance of Punjab? Bhangra. Which is the famous folk dance of Gujarat? Garba. Which is the famous folk dance of Rajasthan? Ghumar. Which is the famous folk dance of Maharashtra? Lavani. Which is the major folk dance of Uttar Pradesh? Nautanki. Which is the famous folk dance of Bihar? Jat Jatin. Which is the famous folk dance of Haryana? Fag. Which is the famous folk dance of West Bengal? Chhau. Which is the famous folk dance of Assam? Bihu. Which is the major folk dance of Odisha? Ghumura. Which is the famous folk dance of Tamil Nadu? Karagattam. Which is the major folk dance of Kerala? Thiyam. Which is the famous folk dance of Karnataka? Yakshangana. Which is the major folk dance of Andhra Pradesh? Viranaitam. Which is the major folk dance of Telangana? Perini Shivatandanam. Which is the famous folk dance of Madhya Pradesh? Gondi dance. Which is the major folk dance of Chhattisgarh? Panthi. Which is the famous folk dance of Jharkhand? Karma. Which is the major folk dance of Himachal Pradesh? Nati. Which is the famous folk dance of Uttarakhand? Chulia. Which is the major folk dance of Jammu and Kashmir? Rauf. Which is the famous folk dance of Sikkim? Singhi Cham. Which is the major folk dance of Manipur? Lai Haraoba. Which is the famous folk dance of Nagaland? War dance. Which is the major folk dance of Meghalaya? Wangala. Which is the famous folk dance of Mizoram? Chirao. Which is the major folk dance of Tripura? Hojagiri. Which is the famous folk dance of Arunachal Pradesh? Bardo Cham.